You've been patient with your child all day. You've validated their feelings, named their emotions, offered choices instead of commands. You've bent down to eye level, used your soft voice, explained why we don't hit instead of simply saying no. And now, at 8:30 at night, when they're screaming because you won't give them a fourth cookie, something inside you quietly breaks. Not with rage, you've learned to manage that, but with something worse, a creeping exhaustion that whispers, "I'm doing everything right, so why does this feel so wrong?" Here's what nobody tells you about gentle parenting. It's not actually gentle, not on you, and possibly not on your child either. Because hidden inside this well-intentioned approach to raising children is a psychological trap that Jung would have recognized immediately. A trap that doesn't just exhaust parents, but potentially derails the very process of individuation it claims to support. Welcome to Deep Psyche Lab, where we explore the hidden patterns that shape your inner world. I'm here to guide you through the psychological terrain beneath our cultural moments, and today, we're diving into something that might make you uncomfortable. If you're new here, subscribe and hit the notification bell, because we go deeper than surface-level psychology. We're not here to tell you how to parent. We're here to illuminate what's actually happening in the psyche when we adopt these frameworks without understanding their shadow. Before we go further, let me be clear about what this exploration is and isn't. We're not dismissing attachment theory, the importance of emotional attunement, or the value of treating children with respect. These are genuine advances in our understanding of child development. What we're examining is what happens when a psychological framework becomes a cultural movement, when practices rooted in research get filtered through social media, stripped of nuance, and transformed into a new kind of perfectionism that may be creating the very problems it seeks to solve. The gentle parenting movement rose alongside Instagram and mommy blogs in the mid-2010s, positioning itself as the antidote to authoritarian parenting styles that dominated previous generations. Its core principles sound unassailable. Validate emotions, set boundaries with empathy, avoid punishment in favor of natural consequences, treat children as whole people deserving of respect. Jung himself would have appreciated the emphasis on acknowledging the child's inner experience rather than simply controlling behavior. But Jung also understood something that gets lost in our therapeutic culture. The psyche develops through tension, not just through acceptance. In his work on the transcendent function, the psyche's capacity to hold opposites and generate new possibilities, Jung described how consciousness emerges from conflict. The ego strengthens not by being endlessly validated, but by encountering the resistance of reality and discovering its own resourcefulness in response. Remove all friction, and you don't get a more developed human being. You get someone who never learned to stand. Walk into any playground in an affluent neighborhood, and you'll witness the performance. A 3-year-old grabs a toy from another child. The gentle parent descends, voice modulated carefully. "I see you really wanted that truck." It's hard to wait, isn't it? But your friend was playing with it first. How do you think they feel when you take their toy? The child, predictably, doesn't care how the other child feels. They're 3. But the parent continues the emotional coaching, the extended validation, the processing. Meanwhile, the other child stands there, toy stolen, watching an adult turn their violation into a teachable moment for the violator. This is where gentle parenting reveals its shadow, what it refuses to acknowledge about itself. It has become a form of ego management for adults, dressed up as child-centered practice. The parent gets to see themselves as enlightened, patient, emotionally intelligent. They're not like their parents were. They're breaking generational cycles. They're doing the work. But who is this performance actually serving? Jung wrote extensively about the persona, the mask we present to the world, the constructed identity we maintain to meet social expectations. For many modern parents, especially mothers, the gentle parenting persona has become the dominant way they prove their worth. They're not just raising children, they're demonstrating their psychological sophistication, their emotional availability, their commitment to doing better than the generation before them. The child becomes the stage on which the parent's idealized self-image is enacted. In Jungian terms, this is a classic example of inflation, when the ego identifies with an archetypal role rather than maintaining a relationship with it. The archetype at play here is the Great Mother, that primal force of nurturance and protection. But when a parent inflates into the archetype, believing they must be the all-accepting, all-patient, never-frustrated container for every emotional experience their child has, they lose their humanity. And losing your humanity around your children teaches them something dangerous: that real people don't have limits, needs, or breaking points. The shadow of gentle parenting isn't yelling. It isn't punishment. It's the tyranny of endless emotional processing. It's the parent who explains and validates and offers choices until the child learns that their emotions are so powerful, so important, so central, that adult reality must constantly bend around them. This isn't empowerment. This is burdening a developing psyche with the weight of its own undifferentiated feelings without providing the structure needed to metabolize them. Consider what happens in the child's internal world when every feeling is immediately validated and processed. Jung understood that the psyche organizes itself through opposition and synthesis. The ego strengthens by encountering the not I, the external world that doesn't conform to our wishes, the parent who says no and means it, the reality that remains unmoved by our tantrums. This friction isn't trauma when delivered without cruelty. It's information. It's the necessary resistance that allows the child to discover the boundaries of self and other, to develop frustration tolerance, to understand that their inner experience, while real and valid, doesn't control external reality. But gentle parenting, in its distorted form, treats every boundary as a potential wound. The parent who sets a limit without extensive emotional preamble is seen as harsh. The parent who allows their child to experience disappointment without immediately swooping in to process it is viewed as neglectful. The message becomes, your emotions are too powerful for you to handle alone, too dangerous to simply feel and move through. You need an adult to co-regulate every experience, to name every feeling, to walk you through every minor frustration as if it were a psychological emergency. This is not what attachment theorists intended. John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth, whose work forms the foundation of attachment-based parenting, never suggested that parents should be endlessly available emotional processors. Secure attachment comes from a parent who is good enough, responsive to genuine distress, but not so enmeshed that the child never develops their own capacity for self-soothing. The securely attached child learns that the parent will be there when truly needed, but also that minor frustrations are survivable without intervention. In Jung's developmental framework, the child must gradually separate from the participation mystique, that early state of psychological fusion with the mother. This separation doesn't happen through endless attunement. It happens through small, manageable disillusionments. The mother who can't read every need, the father who doesn't always understand, the parent who is sometimes tired, sometimes distracted, sometimes just a regular person who says, I need you to stop asking me questions for 5 minutes because I'm at my limit. These micro-separations, delivered without cruelty but with honesty, teach the child something essential. You are separate from me, and that's okay. Your feelings are yours to feel, and I don't need to rescue you from them. I'm here if you need help, but I trust you to handle more than you think you can. The gentle parenting movement, at its most inflated, can't tolerate this necessary distance. It positions the parent as the eternal mediator between the child and their own experience, the interpreter who must translate every emotion, the coach who must be present for every struggle. This isn't attunement. This is enmeshment dressed in therapeutic language, and here's where it gets psychologically dangerous. When a child grows up with this level of emotional management from the outside, they never develop a strong internal locus of control. Jung called this the development of the ego complex, the organizing center of consciousness that says, I am here, separate from you, capable of tolerating my own experience. Children who are endlessly validated but never asked to tolerate frustration, who are given infinite emotional processing but rarely expected to simply deal with disappointment, don't develop robust egos. They develop fragile ones, constantly looking outside themselves for someone to regulate what they feel, explain what they experience, affirm that their discomfort matters more than anyone else's needs. We're already seeing this in therapeutic settings. Young adults who were raised with intensive gentle parenting often present with what therapists are starting to call fragile resilience. They have extensive emotional vocabulary and high self-awareness, but catastrophically low frustration tolerance. They can name their feelings beautifully. They just can't function when those feelings are uncomfortable. They've been taught that every emotion deserves attention, processing, and accommodation, but not that some emotions are simply meant to be felt and then released without intervention. There's a myth that captures this dynamic perfectly, though it's not one Jung wrote about extensively. In Greek mythology, the goddess Demeter so loved her daughter Persephone that she created eternal spring, a world without death or scarcity. When Persephone was taken to the underworld, Demeter's grief was so complete that she withdrew her blessing and the world fell into winter. But here's what we forget: Persephone had to go to the underworld. The myth isn't about preventing the descent, it's about learning to return from it. Persephone becomes queen of the underworld, moving between darkness and light, teaching her mother that protection isn't the same as development. Gentle parenting, in its shadow form, is Demeter trying to prevent the descent entirely. It's the parent who wants to create endless spring for their child, removing every stone from the path, processing every shadow before it can be encountered, ensuring that development happens without pain. But Jung was clear: you cannot individuate without encountering your shadow. You cannot develop a strong ego without friction. You cannot become who you are meant to be if someone is always standing between you and the consequences of your choices. Now, some of you might be thinking, but what about children who've experienced real trauma? Don't they need extra sensitivity? And yes, absolutely. But there's a crucial distinction between trauma-informed care and the assumption that all children are constantly on the verge of being traumatized by normal parental limits. The gentle parenting movement, particularly in online spaces, has conflated these categories. Setting a boundary without a 10-minute emotional processing session isn't traumatic. Saying no and walking away isn't abandonment. Allowing your child to be disappointed isn't neglect. In fact, Jung would argue that consistently shielding children from disappointment is its own form of harm because it prevents them from developing what he called the reality principle, the Psyche's capacity to accept that the world doesn't revolve around our wishes. Children who never bump up against firm, loving limits don't learn to regulate their expectations. They learn that if they escalate emotionally enough, if they express their feelings intensely enough, reality will eventually bend. Watch what happens in public spaces now. A child wants something they can't have: a candy bar, a toy, another hour at the park. The parent begins the gentle parenting script, validating, offering choices, explaining. The child escalates. The parent, aware of being watched by other parents, continues the performance of patience. The emotional processing extends. Other people's time and space, the people in line behind them, the other families waiting to use the park equipment, becomes secondary to ensuring that this child never experiences the simple disappointment of a parent who says no and means it. This is where gentle parenting reveals another shadow. It often exists in a social vacuum, as if the child and parent are the only people whose needs and feelings matter. But Jung understood that individuation happens in relationship with the collective, not in isolation from it. Children need to learn that they are part of a larger social body, that other people's needs are equally valid, that sometimes you wait your turn, keep your voice down, or accept a no without extended negotiation. Not because your feelings don't matter, but because you're learning to exist in a world with other people. The overemphasis on the individual child's emotional experience can actually prevent them from developing what Jung called participation in the collective, the capacity to sense yourself as part of something larger, to feel appropriate guilt or shame when you violated a social contract, to internalize values beyond your own immediate comfort. If this perspective is landing for you, if something here is clarifying what you've observed but couldn't name, take a moment and hit the like button. It helps this kind of depth psychology reach more people who are hungry for frameworks beyond the surface conversation. Let's go deeper into what Jung would say about the parent's psyche in all of this, because that's where the real transformation needs to happen. The parent who is compulsively gentle, who cannot tolerate their child's distress even briefly, who must explain and validate and process every emotion. This parent is not primarily responding to the child's needs. They're managing their own anxiety. Jung wrote about the concept of projection, how we place our unresolved psychological material onto others. For many parents, especially those who experienced harsh or dismissive parenting themselves, their child's distress triggers their own unhealed childhood wounds. When the child cries, the parent doesn't just hear that child, they hear their own childhood self, still crying, still unheard. and so they rush to fix it, to ensure this child never feels what they felt, to be the parent they wish they'd had. This is understandable. It's deeply human, but it's also a projection that burdens the child with the parent's unfinished business. The child doesn't need a parent who heals their own childhood through their parenting. The child needs a parent who has done enough of their own psychological work that they can distinguish between their child's actual needs and their own triggered responses. Jung called this the necessity of withdrawing projections, the difficult work of recognizing when you're responding to your own material rather than to the reality in front of you. The parent who has done this work can hold space for their child's upset without needing to immediately fix it. They can set a boundary without guilt because they understand that limits aren't harm. They can tolerate being temporarily disliked by their child because their sense of self isn't dependent on being seen as the perfect, endlessly patient nurturer. This is where the shadow work for parents becomes crucial. What are you actually afraid will happen if you set a firm boundary without extensive emotional preamble? That your child won't know you love them? That they'll remember this moment as trauma? That you'll become the harsh parent you feared? These fears, when examined, usually point to the parent's unresolved relationship with authority, with their own needs, with the parts of themselves they've judged as unacceptable. The parent who is compulsively gentle often hasn't integrated their own inner tyrant, that part of the psyche that can say no without apology, that can prioritize their own needs without guilt, that can be, in Jung's terms, appropriately selfish. Instead, they've exiled that aspect to the shadow where it festers. And where does it go? Sometimes into passive-aggressive rigidity, dressed as gentleness. Sometimes into explosions when the performance becomes unsustainable. Sometimes into the child who acts out the aggression and selfishness the parent can't consciously own. This is the concept Jung called the identification of opposites. The more compulsively gentle the parent tries to be, the more they create the conditions for its opposite to emerge. The child becomes increasingly demanding, testing whether there's actually a firm bottom to this endless negotiation. The parent's resentment builds behind the gentle persona until it erupts in ways that feel more harmful than simple, honest boundaries would have been. What would integration look like instead? It would look like a parent who can access both sides of the polarity, who can be tender and firm, validating and boundaried, empathetic and clear. This parent doesn't need to perform gentleness because they've integrated their capacity for appropriate authority. They can say, "I know you're upset about this and you're still not getting another cookie," without a 10-minute processing session because they trust that their child can handle disappointment. They can feel annoyed, tired, touched out, done, and still be a good parent because they understand that children actually develop better in relationship with real humans who have limits than with endlessly patient performers who pretend to be superhuman. Jung wrote that the greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of the parent. When parents sacrifice their own needs, boundaries, and humanity on the altar of gentle parenting perfection, what are they teaching their children? That adults don't matter, that caregiving requires self-erasure, that expressing needs is selfish, that boundaries are violence. These aren't conscious lessons, but they're absorbed nonetheless, shaping the child's future relationships, their capacity to set boundaries, their expectations of others. The irony is that children don't actually want parents who are endlessly gentle. They want parents who are real. They want to know where the walls are. They want to bump up against firmness so they can discover their own shape against it. A child raised with clear, consistent boundaries delivered with basic kindness, not extensive emotional processing, just, "This is the limit, I love you, and we're done discussing it," develops a felt sense of safety that endless negotiation never provides. Think about it from the child's perspective, using Jung's understanding of the archetypal layer. Children aren't just relating to their personal parents, they're encountering archetypes. The father archetype provides structure, order, the law. The mother archetype provides nurturance, connection, acceptance. Both are necessary. Both contain light and shadow. When parents try to be only the light side of the mother archetype, all acceptance, all validation, all emotional availability, they leave a gaping hole where the father archetype should be providing structure. This doesn't map onto gender. Single mothers can provide both. Fathers can access the mother archetype, but the functions need to be present. The child needs to encounter the voice that says, "This is reality, this is the boundary, this is what's expected of you." When that voice is missing or so softened that it becomes negotiable, The child's psyche has nothing to push against, no structure within which to develop, and so we see children who've been raised with intensive, gentle parenting entering adolescence and young adulthood without a developed sense of self-discipline, because discipline was always externalized into these lengthy emotional processing sessions rather than internalized as a capacity for self-regulation. They have rich emotional vocabularies but poor executive function. They can tell you how they feel about having to do something difficult, but they can't actually make themselves do it. This isn't speculation. This is what educators, therapists, and employers are reporting about the generation raised with this approach. High emotional intelligence, low grit. Great self-awareness, poor follow-through. Excellent at naming problems. Terrible at tolerating the discomfort required to solve them. These young people aren't lazy or entitled in some inherent way. They're the logical outcome of a parenting philosophy that emphasizes validating every feeling over developing. The capacity to act despite uncomfortable feelings, Jung would recognize this is a failure of ego development. The ego, the I, that can say, I will do this difficult thing even though I don't want to, strengthens through repeated experiences of tolerating frustration and discovering your capacity to handle it. If parents constantly buffer that frustration, constantly mediate between the child and discomfort, the ego never develops that muscle. And so you get young adults who fall apart at the first hint of difficulty, who need extensive emotional support to do basic tasks, who genuinely cannot distinguish between this is hard and this is harmful. Here's what makes this particularly insidious. It's all done with love. The parents aren't trying to harm their children. They're trying to do better, to break cycles, to raise emotionally healthy humans. But they've been sold a framework that confuses emotional awareness with emotional resilience, that treats all distress as equally significant, that sees parental authority as inherently oppressive rather than as a necessary force in shaping a child's developing psyche. The collective shadow we're avoiding is this: children need more than gentleness. They need the full spectrum of human relationship. They need parents who can be soft and hard, yielding and firm, accepting and demanding. They need to encounter limitation, frustration, disappointment, and the discovery that they can survive it. They need parents who are human enough to be tired, annoyed, and done, and who model that these states don't equal lack of love. In alchemical terms, which Jung studied extensively, transformation requires both solve et coagula, dissolving and coagulating, breaking down and reforming. Gentle parenting at its most distorted is all solve, endless dissolving of boundaries, constant softening, perpetual emotional liquefaction. But without coagula, without the reforming into solid structure, you don't get transformation. You get formlessness. And a formless child doesn't become a free adult. They become an anxious one, forever looking for someone to provide the container that was never internalized. This is what Jung meant by the necessity of the transcendent. Function, the psyche's capacity to hold opposing truths in tension until a third thing emerges. The parent who can hold both, I want to honor my child's feelings, and I need to set a firm limit without collapsing into either extreme, is accessing this function. They're not choosing between being gentle or being authoritarian. They're finding the third way that contains both, what we might call conscious boundaried love. The path forward isn't to swing back to authoritarian parenting. Jung would never advocate for that. The old model, children should be seen and not heard. Spare the rod, spoil the child, because I said so, caused genuine harm, created genuine trauma, passed down genuine wounds. We don't want to return there. But we also can't stay in this inflated therapeutic space where every parenting choice is treated as a potential trauma, where children are so centered that they never learn they're part of a larger world, where parents perform endless patience while their resentment builds in the shadow. The integration would look like this: validate feelings, set boundaries clearly, move on. I know you wanted to stay longer. We're leaving now. You can be upset about it. And then you leave. You don't spend 20 minutes processing their disappointment in the parking lot. You trust that they can be upset and be okay, that their disappointment won't damage them, that your clear boundary, delivered with basic empathy, but without performance, is exactly what their developing psyche needs. It means saying no without guilt. It means sometimes being the temporary bad guy, because you understand that children need to practice being mad at their parents in safe ways so they learn that relationships can survive conflict. It means modeling that adults have needs too, that caregivers deserve respect, that sometimes you do things you don't want to do because that's part of being human. It means releasing the fantasy of perfect parenting and accepting good enough parenting, that Winnicottian concept that Jung would have appreciated. The good enough parent isn't endlessly patient. They're reliably present and genuinely human. They mess up and repair. They have limits and apologize when they overstep them. They're real, which means they're sometimes frustrated, sometimes tired, sometimes touched out and done. And they trust their child to handle the truth of who they are. This is the real breaking of generational cycles, not performing a therapeutic ideal, but doing your own shadow work so you can show up as a whole person, not a persona. When you've integrated your own inner authority, you don't need to be compulsively gentle because you're not afraid of your own power. When you've worked with your own childhood wounds, you can distinguish between your child's actual distress and your triggered response. When you've accepted your own needs as valid, you can set boundaries without guilt because you understand that self-sacrifice doesn't actually serve anyone. The children of parents who do this work, not the work of perfect, gentle parenting, but the work of psychological integration, grow up with something precious, a model of what it looks like to be human, to have needs and voice them, to have limits and enforce them, to make mistakes and repair them, to be angry, tired, imperfect, and still loving. This is what creates secure attachment, not the performance of endless patience. This is what allows for healthy individuation, a child who separates from a real person, not from an idealized therapeutic construct. So if you've been trying to gentle parent your way to perfection, if you're exhausted from the emotional labor of processing every feeling, if you're starting to resent your child for needs you taught them were paramount, this is your permission to stop, not to become harsh, to become real. To set boundaries that honor both your child's humanity and your own. To trust that your child is more resilient than gentle parenting culture gives them credit for. To believe that they can handle your no, your tiredness, your occasional frustration, and emerge stronger for having encountered a real human rather than a performance of ideal parenting. Your children don't need you to be their therapist, their emotional translator, their perpetual validator. They need you to be their parent, loving, present, boundaried, and human. The rest is just noise designed to sell courses, books, and the fantasy that if you just try hard enough, parent consciously enough, you can ensure your child never suffers. But suffering isn't the enemy. Unintegrated suffering is. And integration doesn't come from having every feeling validated. It comes from learning you can survive disappointment, tolerate frustration, and discover your own capacity to regulate without constant outside intervention. That's the psychological truth that gentle parenting's shadow doesn't want to face. Children don't need perfect attunement. They need good enough parents who are real enough to occasionally get it wrong and secure enough in themselves to set boundaries without guilt.
That's what creates healthy adults.
Not the performance of therapeutic perfection, but the messy reality of human relationship where both parties matter, both parties have needs, and love doesn't mean endless accommodation. Your child will be okay if you say no and mean it. They'll survive your frustration. They'll benefit from encountering your limits, and you'll model something essential, that adults get to have boundaries, needs, and bad days, and still be good people. That's not gentle parenting, that's conscious parenting, and it's what your child's psyche actually needs to individuate into a strong, resilient, whole human being. This channel explores psychology for self-understanding and is not a substitute for professional therapy. If this exploration shifted something for you, leave a comment with just one word: boundaries. I want to know this perspective landed. Thank you for going this deep with me. If you're hungry for more depth psychology that challenges our cultural assumptions, subscribe to Deep Psyche Lab and hit the notification bell so you don't miss when we dive into the next hidden pattern shaping your inner world. The work of psychological integration isn't easy, but you're here doing it. That matters. Until next time, stay conscious, stay real, and trust yourself more than the performance.